another episode of The Inclusive Therapist. My name is Zara Somani. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist associate, and I'm here to talk about all things related to couples, family, sex therapy. I come from a South Asian background, so I'm really excited to bring in the South Asian lens as we talk about things that I hope are normal one day that are today stigmatized. I am here, as I am every week, with Dr. Kendall. Go right ahead.
Hi, my name is Dr. Kendall. I am a therapist and the owner of Relevant Connections. I'm also a professor at National University where I teach courses on couples therapy, sex therapy, addictions, and research.
Awesome. We are super excited to bring you yet another juicy episode. So today's episode is on a question that we get almost, I don't know, how many times a day?
Oh, multiple times.
Yeah, multiple times a day. Hi, looking for therapy. Do you take insurance? So we're here to talk about the insurance part of what it means to be a therapist. We know there's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of confusion around this. And so we want to talk a little bit about how insurance kind of came into our industry, what it actually looks like on our end, what it means for you to have insurance or not take insurance. And also we're going to talk a little bit more about what it means to find a therapist. So we talked about this a couple episodes ago, but we're going to kind of get into a little bit more detail for your benefit. So let's get started.
Yes.
All right. So let's say, let's talk about insurance. So we know that insurance is something that is just so commonplace in the medical model.
Right.
It actually wasn't very common in couples therapy or mental health in general, right?
I think before the pandemic, it was even more scarce. It was hard to find a therapist who was paneled. I mean, they were certainly out there, but since the pandemic and the push for mental health, I mean, a lot of therapists are certainly paneled with insurance companies. But I think we really have to differentiate between like couples and family therapists and like people who focus on individuals, because it is a different ballgame.
It is a different ballgame. And I think it's also, insurance is a new thing to our field of mental health also in general.
Right.
If you talk about 5 years ago even, I don't know that this was even a thing that was covered by insurance. Right. And now that it is, there's a lot of differences, as Dr. Kendall said, between individuals and couples and family. Let's start talking about that. So what, in your opinion, what should the audience know that they don't know?
Well, I think one of the things where our practice is private pay only. And when I was establishing our practice and trying to figure out, what to do, whether I should be with insurance or not be with insurance, I really had to look at the sustainability of our practice. And in order for us to have a physical location with enough space for everybody, when I looked at the reimbursement rates for couples and families, it was so low that we would have to see, I don't even know, maybe like 40 to 50 people a day or something crazy, right?
Yeah.
And shockingly, when I looked at the numbers for reimbursement, they were actually going to offer me more money just to see an individual, almost double,
right,
than to see two people as a couple or two people as a family. And I thought that is just insane. I can't sustain a practice on these kind of reimbursement rates. And so we chose to go the private practice route.
Right. It really makes me wonder who is setting these rates and how, and where this justification is coming from.
Right.
So for you guys, one of the things we get to do is talk a little bit about our therapeutic process and what it means to be a therapist in this conversation too. So when Dr. Kendall says, the expectation to be sustainable is to see 40, 50 clients, the average amount that you should not usually exceed, it's not recommended to see more than 20 clients a week.
20 to 30 max. Yeah. I can definitely say if I was only seeing individuals or only seeing adolescents or something, it takes a lot less brain energy for me and emotional energy. But when you've got two people and you're navigating conflict, and you're navigating both of their perspectives, it's double the work.
Right.
And so my emotional battery, my level of burnout can certainly increase much faster if I'm having to see that many couples a week.
Exactly. So when we think about like a 40-hour work week, I used to be a teacher. So even as teachers, we don't teach for 40 hours in the classroom. We teach for 20 to 25, and the rest of it goes into indirect hours. So preparation, notes, research, talking to colleagues, supervision. And that's an important part of it, but what you mentioned is really critical. Teaching for 40 hours in a classroom doesn't make any sense, and taking on emotional labor for 40 hours a week is not a healthy place to be in for most of us.
Well, you get checked out, right? You get
Yeah.
burned out, and then you're not an effective therapist.
Right.
You're just kind of being maybe a mirror, a sounding board,
Right.
but you're not really doing the work and asking the hard questions or diving for the deeper issues.
Right.
It just stays very surface level.
Exactly. So we're not able to do our jobs effectively. And one of the things that I find, both as a teacher and a therapist, that isn't always recognized until you're in the room doing it, is the level of presence that you need to have, right? So to be able to track what one person's saying, their movements, their interactions, the response cycle between two people. And if you've got a family, you're looking at, sometimes I've got like 7 people in a room, and looking at all of the different roles that they play, their past, bringing that in. It's really
a lot of thoughts
very
going on all at one time.
process. Absolutely. And so it takes a lot of effort. So there's only a capacity to charge. When we charge like an hourly rate, you're already cutting that in half basically as your hourly rate. And then you've got an insurance sort of taking part of it off the top. Right. And so a lot of times I've noticed that my friends will start to say, especially post-COVID, I'm looking for a therapist, and almost nobody I know has an in-person location. So some people really like virtual, and that's awesome, and that works for them. Some people really prefer coming in person. However, even when I crunched the numbers, it was pretty much impossible to sustain an actual physical location if you are getting the rates you're getting through insurance. Yeah.
I completely agree. And working with couples and families, I think in person is better. And I know that virtual can be really easier for families, sometimes getting everybody in.
Yeah.
But there's just something different for me about being in person. And so that is why I prioritized that and wanted to have a practice that was sustainable with a physical location.
Yeah. I think there is definitely research that's coming out, especially now, around the efficacy of in-person versus virtual. And the jury's out on that. But there is something to be said for being in a physical location, understanding the interactions, the very slight body movement, right? The slight
energy
eye contact, the energy in the room. If their camera's not working well, you're missing out on a lot of that information.
And you get those little micro, just like freezing moments, and I'm like, was that an important word that I missed or a feeling? And so, we've all walked into a room where our partner or somebody is mad, and you feel that energy, right?
Yeah.
And so that is why I prefer in person, because I can feel the shifts. We can get that connection in a way that just feels more effective than online.
I actually happen to really like virtual therapy for a lot of reasons. I think it makes things so much more accessible for people.
Right, and it definitely works. I don't want to. This is my personal preference that I'm.
But what's to say, right, is that both of these modalities are great, but the benefit is that we have the option to do either one, because we can afford to have a physical location. Right. Which for a lot of people, especially now, I've noticed a pendulum swing of, during COVID and immediately after, everyone was like, oh, virtual's great.
And it was.
Yeah, it was. And now you're seeing a shift in all domains, right? So whether it's dating, whether it's, going to work, whether it's coming into therapy, that there's a shift back towards I want to be in person. There's something to be said for that physical energy that you are in the presence of.
We all got tired of being at home, and now we're all ready to go back to our in-person lifestyle.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about insurance and the payment. Let's talk about the back processes. So one part of insurance that's important to know is the cost of it to you and to us, and what the cost benefit is, right? So for example, the cost of it is not having a physical location at times. But there's more to insurance than just the cost. So let's talk a little bit about diagnosing and the sort of plan that we get to make, the diagnosing plan and the treatment plan that we get to make.
So one of the reasons I chose LMFT over like maybe LPC or some other license, or like a social worker, is because we really promote like that we don't like to diagnose, right? What benefit does it say if you bring your partner and I say, oh, they're a narcissist, right? Well, that doesn't change, what's going on. And so, but when we take insurance, we are required to offer somebody a diagnosis. And so, if you and your partner are in a fight and you want to come through it and work on that, if I took insurance as a provider, I would have to say, oh, one of you is depressed or one of you has anxiety. Right. And then we would create our plan of action, our working plan together around that diagnosis. And that for me just doesn't fit, because sometimes the problem is not one person's anxiety
Correct.
or one person's depression. Maybe it's communication. And unfortunately, I have never seen a DSM diagnosis around poor communication.
Correct.
So,
I want to really emphasize this point, actually. So, because I think, unless you're in this space, the medical model is what this country knows.
Right.
Right? So, diagnosing the medical model and systems therapy are actually very, very different.
Right.
And I didn't understand this until I went to school. And that Dr. Kendall's right that you may have depressive symptoms, especially if there's something happening in your system that's not great.
Of course.
But in order to get in insurance, in order to get reimbursed, you have to be able to have something that you are working towards. You have to have a diagnosis, because that's what happens in the medical model. You've got a diagnosis, you've got GERD, you've got cancer, you've got high blood pressure, and therefore these treatments are recommended. But in here, we don't pathologize. So I actually I've had several clients, and we've talked about this before, that are potentially on the spectrum.
Right.
And that, and there's a whole different conversation that we can have later about the benefits of diagnosing somebody versus not. But at the end of the day, Dr. Kendall's right. It's not just about, oh, you have this label. Actually, more important is, what are the ways it's showing up for you and in your relationship? Is it impairing function? And that is what we get to focus on, irrespective of the label.
Right.
Sometimes, because of the model that we live and die by these labels, and they become sometimes these illnesses, or in the medical model, or these diagnoses become who we are,
right,
as opposed to a part of our experience right now. And that in and of itself can hold us back from our treatment.
Absolutely. And these labels, they stick, right?
Correct.
I believe it's bipolar, you can't even get life insurance if it's on record.
That's right.
I would never, and I have worked with so many people who had inappropriate bipolar diagnoses. And I mean, recently, last week, I had a woman who, she came in with a bipolar diagnosis. I met with her several times, and I'm like, I know bipolar, right? I've seen the signs, but it just did not fit.
Right.
And so we started talking more about when she was diagnosed, and she was 3 weeks postpartum when she was diagnosed, and I was like,
Changes everything.
Absolutely. And this was 20 something years ago when she was diagnosed, and she's carried this label and this stigma and this belief in her that she had this disorder, and really it doesn't fit. And thankfully we were able to have a really good conversation around talking with her psychiatrist around maybe tapering off some of the medications and trying different things, because I really think at a certain point, sometimes medication can cause more harm than good.
Absolutely,
if it's an inappropriate diagnosis.
Yeah, correct. And that medication is helpful, but not the only solution. And often in the medical model, I've seen this with doctors again and again, that if somebody comes in with depressive symptoms, the first line of intervention is a prescription. That's exactly what it is, as opposed to talk therapy, or as opposed to a merging of the two.
Right.
And there are ways around it, sometimes without that.
And sometimes you absolutely need medication.
Right.
I have a client who is struggling with a schizoaffective disorder.
Right.
And so he hears voices, he has beliefs that are not grounded in reality, and that keeps him from functioning in his daily life. So of course I want him to take his medication and use it as needed so that he can be an active member of society.
Right.
But it doesn't always fit, and 15 minutes with the psychiatrist is not always enough. So.
And we're going to talk about that too in a second. Something else I wanted to point out about notes. So I think there's two things, right? That when you are under insurance, you are required to give a diagnosis and a particular treatment plan. When you're not billing under insurance, our treatment plan can change. It can be flexible, creative. So whatever it is that you're coming in with, instead of having to fit it into a diagnosis that is appropriate for insurance, we get to actually think about what is it that's going on, what's causing that, and what do we get to adjust in order to be able to have a more functional life. And as the weeks go on, and as these interventions work or don't work, we can continue to change our treatment plan. So there's a lot more creativity and flexibility with the models that you use, with the path that you take, with what's coming up in session. We can be more experiential and more in the moment with what's happening, as opposed to working towards teaching towards a test or solving towards a diagnosis that's required by an insurance company that doesn't really know any better.
And this is a huge pet peeve of mine, because these insurance companies, they require things like cognitive behavioral therapy or solution focused, and these are great models, and I think most therapists use them at some level, but
Right.
there are so many other models, like one of my favorite is internal family systems,
Right.
and that no insurance company would really reimburse for, but I have found that to be such a
Correct.
powerful model,
Yeah.
and so I hate, that is why I don't want to take insurance, is because it limits my ability and what I can do in the room, and I very much want to tailor my practice to who's in front of me and
Right.
what would work best.
Yeah.
So.
I know that also another thing that comes up from what I've seen is a lot of professionals that want privacy intact don't go the insurance route, and that's huge.
Yes. Well, that brings us to our other about like the written notes that we write.
Correct.
And I do have quite a few clients who let me know early on that they prioritize privacy, and they will always say like, what are you writing down? And when you take notes for insurance and you submit that, those notes are likely or very possibly going to be audited at some point, which means the insurance company is going to read over what we talked about in session and what we were doing. But in private practice, I can be much more, private pay, I'm sorry, I can be much more ambiguous. I still am going to write down in my notes what our goals were for session, what I did in session, which means maybe I was doing a certain intervention, but I'm much less going to write down what my client has talked about or specific things regarding treatment.
Because there's no outside party that you have to justify this to.
Right. It's
That's
just for me and my process to know what I'm working on and what I'm going to pick up on the next time we meet.
So it's interesting because we live in a society where privacy is really, I think, at the top of mind for a lot of us when we have these devices and these trackers and all these kinds of things.
Nothing feels secure.
Nothing feels secure. And so that's another reason why non-insurance practitioners, that there's an added benefit to this of privacy and the ability to do our jobs in a way that, for me, feels ethically secure and warranted.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I would never want the things that my clients share with me to be heard or read about by any other party. That feels like a complete violation of privacy.
Right. Anything else you want to add on insurance? We talked about pay, we talked about privacy and notes, we talked about treatment plans.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, I just want to validate that it is frustrating when you want to go see a therapist and it is expensive to work and to do private pay. But I think that the work you do is valuable, and a lot of people get this idea of like, oh, I'm going to have to do this forever.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
And the research shows like 4 to 6 sessions is really where we begin to get a good kind of change, right? Some of our first goals can be met in those few sessions, and then I think the average for couples therapy is like 8 to 10. But this does not mean that we have to have 4 to 6 sessions in a 1 month period or a 2 month period. That I think it is just as beneficial that if I can meet once a month or twice a month, that is absolutely doable to, you know, not necessarily every week like you might do with insurance. But I actually see a lot of benefit to doing this work, having conversations, letting that information process and integrate, and doing the process slower rather than cramming it all in. And so if finance is an issue, doing it on your timeline and your budget is absolutely okay.
I had a whole year of interning at UT Southwestern when we did behavioral health clinic, and the model there was 30 minutes per patient once every 4 to 6 weeks. And I remember pushing back on my supervisor at the time and being like, there is no way you can have effective therapy. I mean, the model that we all used to is weekly on a couch 50 minutes, and that's what it is, right? And I'm like, it was unfathomable to me that you could have therapy be successful in 30 minutes in 4 to 6 weeks, once every 4 to 6 weeks. And what the changes I saw in my clients were remarkable. They were remarkable. And part of that comes because you know you're not coming weekly.
It's efficient, right? You know you want to do the work, and you get there and you work hard, and then you take some time to integrate it.
Yeah. So if you're in crisis, that might look a little different, but also crisis doesn't last forever. So sometimes what I have my clients do is if they're coming to me in crisis, I say, all right, you know, let's do 4 weeks or 3 weeks back to back, and then let's reassess and slow it down so that it fits and you're not in this, you know, immediate sort of fight or flight, ride or die mode.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I agree with that.
The other thing I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about today was, like we mentioned earlier, the different types of therapists and what we all do. So there's a little bit of confusion, I think, around our degrees and our process.
Right.
Last time we talked about the difference between a licensed professional counselor who usually sees individuals versus a marriage and family therapist,
right.
social worker, but we've got some other pieces in this as well, right? So you want to talk a little bit about the accreditation process and schools, therapists that come from schools that are accredited?
So there are several accrediting boards that they're there to make sure that therapists get a good education. And so for MFTs, it's called COAMTA. Oh, don't put me on the spot to remember what that all stands for. For LPCs, it's called KCREP, and that I definitely don't know. But these boards will go over every university and the courses that they're promoting and the training they're getting. They also talk about how and when to take licensing exams, and they just keep these universities very accountable for the level of therapists that they are producing. And I do think that there can be a difference as a supervisor and somebody who's worked with interns and new therapists from multiple universities, as I do see a difference in therapists coming from an accredited university versus a non-accredited university. And so if I was looking for a therapist right now, I would definitely want to know what university you went to. You know, was this an accredited university, and what have you done for training since being out of the program?
Right.
And so that I think is just important to note, because it can be really confusing going out and looking for a therapist.
Yeah. So as you're sort of shopping for one, that's helpful to know. The other thing that I really want to draw attention to is the difference between talk therapists and psychiatrists. Psychiatrists spend a lot of time on the pharmacological piece, so medication management, diagnosing.
Right.
Also, psychologists are great for going to diagnosing also for behavioral disorders, right?
That tends to be their specialty.
Right.
But I do want to say that throughout all of these, people can go get, additional training and be really good. Like, you might have a psychologist who becomes a couples therapist, and that doesn't, that is completely normal.
Right.
But in general, like, we come out of the program trained to work with marriage and family, where some other people might not.
Right. So if you're going to seek a psychiatrist, don't be surprised if your appointment is like 15 minutes. They usually don't see people for very long. Some of them might, or you might be able to talk to them and request it. But their training is they go through medical school and then specialize. So some people who go to medical school will specialize in OBGYN or in emergency medicine or internal medicine, and then you have psychiatry. So their degree is very different. They go through the biological, chemical understandings of the body, and then understand the mind and the brain chemicals and how it works. And some of them will do talk therapy. Most of them will be the ones that you go to for the prescriptions that your doctor may, or like that either your PCP can give or a psychiatrist can give, especially if you have higher diagnoses.
And it's funny, over the years, I've worked with several psychiatrists, and after working with me, they're like, why don't they teach us this in med school? This stuff is so important.
Again and again and again. And often, like, my brother's a physician, so I remember him going through med school, and his exposure, understanding to mental health at the time was a psych ward.
Right.
And so that sort of carries forward this archaic,
stigma.
Exactly, and this archaic way of understanding mental health, which is that it is you're crazy or you're not, as opposed to the very different experiences that we have that
it's like levels of support.
Exactly, right? And the different experiences that we can have that impact us mentally, physically, emotionally. That's normal to any human being. And how do we manage that and work through that without sort of being in the psych ward, which is a very different
that's a crisis point. That is like my brain is unbalanced. That is on the far end of a continuum, where the continuum is very wide, and that's like the top 10%.
Exactly.
And
so there's much more to it than that, but often your psychiatrists don't always have exposure to that. Some of them do.
Right.
And so a lot of times what we recommend is, if you are in medication, you see a psychiatrist and you see a talk therapist, so that you're able to, the most effective way to treat any sort of anything that you're feeling or dysfunction in your life is to pair it with medicine and talk therapy together at the same time.
And my personal preference is always to try talk therapy first, and then as kind of a second, as needed, then we go for medication.
Even like timeline-wise, talk therapy actually is a little bit more effective, I think, than medication, because when you take medication, it takes 6 to 8 weeks, and often you'll get like an uptick for the first week, and then the rest of it's back to normal, but a little bit worse because you have all the side effects that come with medication.
Right.
And then after 6 to 8 weeks, you can kind of figure out, okay, does this work? Does it not work? It may not work, in which case you go back to the drawing board, you find another medication, you do the whole process again. Whereas 6 to 8 weeks of therapy, and you're in a much better place.
Right. You've got some understanding, maybe some coping tools.
Yeah.
And my other concern with medication, I'm working with a woman right now who is on a SSRI for almost 20 years, and the process for her to detox and taper off has been incredibly painful, like all sorts of side effects.
Yeah.
And so you really want to think twice before beginning a medication. If you need it, absolutely. But if you can try talk therapy first, that is certainly my recommendation.
Yeah. All right. We've had a really robust conversation today. We talked about insurance, money, notes, privacy, types of therapists that you want to go to. Actually, before we end, I want to talk to our audience about the difference between LMFT and LMFT associate, which you might see sometimes. So Dr. Kendall's an LMFT supervisor. I'm an LMFT associate.
Mm-hmm. And that just means that for your first 3,000 hours in in practice, I meet with you weekly and we talk about your cases. And really, it's just a way for newer therapists to learn from more experienced therapists. But I want to make it very clear that LMFTAs coming in already have a solid foundation of experience.
Right.
And it's just that I think it's, most LMFTAs have 1 to 2 years of experience. And by the time you get to a fully licensed LMFT, typically people have 3 to 4 years. And then after that, supervisors tend to get a little bit higher. But I don't know, do you have anything to add to that? Because that's a big misnomer.
It is a big misnomer. And what I want to say as somebody who's an LMFT associate is, she's right. I've had more than a year of training.
Right.
But also that our cases are supervised. So there's nothing that goes, if I have a question, I'm not just out in the open wandering around.
2 therapists for the price of one.
That's exactly what it is. That's a great way to put it. It's 2 therapists for the price of one. So every case is supervised. There's extra resources available. And it becomes a safeguard that I actually think is a really helpful tool for me and for my clients.
Right.
It's much more cutting edge also because we're newer, we've got more access to resources. All right, that's all I've got. Anything else from you?
Nope, that sounds good.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us again. We were so happy to talk to you, and we will see you again next week. Bye.